Cheers, welcome to the panel. Cheers. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. We have had an inspiring few days here at Evoke, and we've been discussing all the exciting things we've seen as a panel as we sat waiting to get going today. We've seen ways that we can reduce emissions, reduce waste, ways we can contribute to others reducing their emissions, and deploying all sorts of amazing technology, including artificial intelligence, seaweed and flies. It's such an exciting space to work in, and you can see the imagination that goes into this, into creating solutions that we'll have to deploy going forward. But as we head for home, we need to discuss other changes that might be required in shaping the pathway to a more sustainable economy in food and agriculture, whether that be changes in the system, changes in the finance, and how we pay for these things, where the investment comes from, and whether we can bring the primary producer with us along for the journey. We want to involve you in this discussion. There is a Slido QR that will appear on the screen that you can scan and send questions that will appear on an iPad I'm holding, and I'd love to hear what's on your mind and address them either generally, or you can make it a specific question to one of the panel. But I have plenty of questions loaded up, and Lewis, I wanted to start with you. Thank you for your amazing presentation. I did want to ask you though, there's an expression that you shouldn't try and change your shoes while you're running, because you tend to fall over if that's the case. We have an amazingly demanding race ahead of us to address a climate emergency. If we don't address that, the people that will be worse off will be those in emerging markets who are already suffering the gap in consumption possibilities. Should we just focus on addressing that climate challenge and work within the existing system, work with the big guys who have market power, yes, but also amazing reach, amazing capacity, the capacity for innovation, and fix the other aspects of our food systems once we've dealt with that first emergency?
Thank you for that. Should we stick with the powerful guys and the main guys right now? Before I answer this question, it's quite important to understand the context within which we're operating. As per the IPCC, we're currently on track to hit about 3 degrees increase in temperature. And there's no credible scenario that shows exactly the consequence of this across the world. We know that increasingly, it will start with lots of developing countries right now, but increasingly, it would touch on everybody. So the systems we are looking at now, we cannot continue to rely on them. That has to change. What this immediately says is, it's not time for us to pick and choose. We are in an emergency, right? It also suggests that a conversation which requires excluding a particular group of persons is a conversation that does not understand the nature of complexity that we're facing. So would they be a part of the solution? Yes. Are there some of them that are trying to be a part of the solution? Yes. A larger problem here is that we have knee-jerk reactions each time we hear some of these. When we think of consumers, we just think it's eco-labeled, or we think it's just how much they consume. What we don't typically reflect on is the context that shapes this consumption, what drives these patterns of consumption that we're seeing. If I'm hungry and I need to eat, and I cannot find food that is sustainably produced and available, or I find it at a price that I cannot afford, I'm relegated to buying the option that is accessible to me. Which means if I do not change the context around which food is provisioned in society, I can never address issues of hunger and sustainable food consumption. We need to see the complexity and how these things interplay with each other.
Okay. It's always helpful to see examples of where it's done better. I understand, I'm sure the audience understand what we're trying to achieve here as you outline it. Can you show us any examples, though, of where that's done well in particular nations or supply chains, or even micro examples of where we see food produced economically, sustainably, with good social engagement and healthy outcomes for consumers?
I'm a big fan of trying to learn from different parts where things have been tested and they've worked very well. Right here, for example, in Vietnam, we know that community land stewardship has worked exceedingly well with very little additional inputs into soils and sustained fertility over long periods. There's clear analysis that have shown this as a really, really good model. We also know that in almost every country now, and this is why technology is so vital here, there's hydroponics and there's emerging innovations in food, in agriculture that are actually helping to reduce stress and pressures. So the idea here is not that there's one society that has figured it out and is doing it perfectly, but there are lots of little examples that we need to borrow from each other and combine that allow for a better system.
Yeah. Yep. Interesting. And just taking that analogy of borrowing from different systems, I wanted to ask Katherine about financing this transition, because we've spoken about the quest ahead of us and the amazing technologies that are being developed, but clearly there's a huge amount of investment going to be required in this system. Do we have to borrow from all the different models that are existing at the moment to make that happen?
Yeah, we definitely do. And just to give a bit of context to my answer, I think someone swore on the panel this morning, so I'll do it as well. I was shitting myself coming here and thinking, what do I have to offer this conversation? And I think one of the biggest things to offer the conversation is actually to tell Australian farmers and founders that we don't know about the amazing solutions that you guys are developing. And so there may be innovations, particularly in the finance space, to borrow and learn from, as you said. But tackling that imposter syndrome of Australian innovation, I think, is going to be one of the major recommendations or sort of takeaways that I come away with. Lewis mentioned earlier that the ag space is not innovating, and I couldn't disagree with that more after the couple of days that I've been here. I am blown away. So yes, I can walk through some of the financing solutions that we're seeing, and of course I know others on the panel will talk to you about different solutions, all the way from early stage VC to private equity to debt to some of the really interesting sort of partnerships with institutional investors. But I have to tell you that one of the best ways that we're going to get finance into this space is communicating more effectively that the innovation is already happening and needs to see scale. So when you ask about examples we've seen in other markets, it was mentioned earlier today that the UK subsidises a load of these technologies and a lot of the innovations in regenerative agriculture. We've seen all sorts of de-risking the use of public and development type money to bring down the risk of new technologies, especially when we talk about nature-based solutions, which not everyone knows the business models work out for. And we've seen quite exciting partnerships across the value chain, whether it's with corporates and other capital providers. But it's no use reinforcing or borrowing all of those financing innovations unless this room, I guess, recognises that you're leagues and leagues ahead. And so some of the conversation or some of the comments that Lewis was making about crisis and emergency and hunger, I think the solutions for a lot of that stuff are in this room, but we have a $200 million VC climate tech fund, and the first thing I did this morning was email home and say, why aren't we looking at the maggots, at the Goterra maggots? Why don't we know about the maggots? And so I would say courage and confidence about the innovation to then connect with capital that's looking for these solutions is probably the biggest lever that you guys have.
And shout out to evokeAG, because that's exactly what we're doing here. That was the concept of this exact conference, is to bring together innovators and create a showcase where you can bring investors and startups together and show all the stuff being done here. Is that enough?
I think there will still be a gap. And by gap, I mean either we are asking farmers to bear the cost of this transition. And what happens actually in emerging markets is that you see a lot of the development banks, the sort of world banks, take on some of that transition risk because they want to unlock capital into these countries and into these sectors. So I don't see that happening. I am an Aussie, but based in London, and I don't see that happening here, that there's relief for the transition risk. It feels like it's being pushed onto producers. So I think there is a real gap at that end. I think the other big gap is that we're in a crap macro environment. We're going to see some easing, I think, of interest rates, but asking capital-intensive innovations to be bearing the cost of first-of-a-kind risk, especially for kind of capital-intensive solutions, what happens often, again, with sort of UK innovation programs, is that first-of-a-kind risk gets taken on, and that there are, I guess, an acknowledgement that when money is not free, as it has been for a long time, when you're facing these kinds of interest rates, you're going to need some kind of again, transition relief and also innovation support so that you can build out the solutions. And of course, I know you'll talk to your kind of innovation programs as well, but fundamentally, it's not enough to have the great ideas in this room because of the macro environment that we're in and because of the competitive environment where you've got other governments sort of subsidizing this transition.
Yeah. Obviously, Natasha, your bank and the big banks in Australia play an enormous role in financing the whole supply chain, but in particular the producer. How are you helping them make this transition?
Yeah, look, it's a great question, and to build on what you've been talking about, Katherine, there are some fabulous solutions, but before I get to that, I actually just really wanted to give a huge shout out to Australian producers. Because to build on your comments, Katherine, the Australian farming community is innovative, it's dynamic, it's vibrant, it's connected, and it is leading the way. And I would like all of you to be assured that Australian agriculture is in exceptional hands. Our primary producers in Australia are at the pointy end of tackling 3 immensely challenging global problems. How do we grow more food to feed or how do we produce more to feed and clothe a growing global population? How do we sequester carbon and lower emissions or avoid emissions? And how do we rebuild natural capital? And Australian producers are leaning into that face first. And so while there might be debate about where we're going, how quickly we're going there, and whether we even should be going there, Australian producers are just getting on with it. And so our role is to support Australian producers and all of those people in this room that support the ecosystem. So whether that's all of you that are in emerging technologies, whether you are in a professional services environment, whether you are doing something else to support those who are growing our produce, there is a real feel of pragmatic optimism about what is possible, and that we want to really focus on the how. So we know there are both risks in transition to a lower carbon future, but there are immense opportunities. And those opportunities really focus on what I would describe as the new triple bottom line. So that new triple bottom line is very much about how do we support the ongoing economic prosperity of the Australian ag sector so that we create capacity and capability to invest in those initiatives which will actually return us a lower carbon future. It is possible to be profitable productive and sustainable. And I think the key word there, Tim, is and. This is an and conversation, not an or conversation. So how do we really help producers deliver that new triple bottom line? Productivity, profitability, and sustainability. So the way that we're thinking about that is at a base level, what are the products and services that our customers and Australian agriculture will need in order to finance the investment in those new technologies or in the change in farm practices that they may want to undertake on farm. And of course, green finance plays a critical role in that. So for those farmers that want to invest in initiatives that result in lower emissions or improve sustainability outcomes, there's heavily discounted finance available, which we're seeing an increased inquiry level about and deep curiosity. But we also want to support the broader agriculture sector by doing things that are a bit unbank-like. And I just want to shout out, for those of you who are from WA, Ken and his team from RLF AgTech are here. And this is an example of how Australian agriculture Lewis is leading. So RLF AgTech is developing a liquid fertiliser in WA for WA environments that can actually build biomass under the soil, improve yield. So you're starting to get this triple bottom line. We're seeing other examples of tech firms that have got some amazing solutions that are looking for ways to simplify things for producers, that are looking for ways to connect farmers with a great experience around understanding their baseline, but importantly, what they can do with that baseline. And so I really want to call out Bobby Miller and the Ruminati team, who are also here. And we're working with Ruminati to support our customers to understand what their baseline emissions measurement is. But importantly, it's not the number today that's important. It's then what might they do with that number. So what might be the farm practices that could be implemented to improve my profitability, my productivity, and have a great sustainable or environmental outcome? And how can I model those actions against my existing farm operations? So I really want to be a pragmatic optimist and say that I want to share the stories of Australian agriculture, because I can literally say that out of everybody in this room today, you all know a great story about people in ag that are innovating, that are getting on with the doing, and are actually really contributing to this global challenge of producing more, emitting less, and looking after nature. So lots of stories to share.
Great. Anna, your business interfaces entirely with the agricultural industry.
That's right.
What are you seeing in terms of producer sentiment around the opportunity in front of them, but also the challenge and the support they are or aren't getting to make that transition?
Yeah, sure. I think there's been a lot of curiosity. I think Natasha said a lot of curiosity from producers around what more they could be doing, but also what's going to be expected of them in the future and what support they can get, particularly from companies like Elders, to implement new practices. But I think, first of all, I'd say most producers would consider themselves to be already adopting sustainable farming practices. I think Australia's been at the forefront of that, with low tillage, no tillage farming, cover crops, crop rotations. If you don't have healthy soil, you don't have a productive farm. So I think also one thing we hear a lot from producers is uncertainty around whether there's going to be policy change in the future and what the return on the investment of practice change will be. And so if there's that uncertainty, they're not willing to commit that capital up front if they can't see the return coming back. And they might not get a price premium. I don't want to add to the commentary on supermarkets this week, but that's a real concern. And we do see some producers adopting regenerative practices, for example, to get market access, particularly to the export market. And we get asked to support them in making those changes. But there's also a lot of conflicting information, and I think it can be a bit of a complex web for producers to sort through what's real and what's not. I think one example, I was out at our branch in Burra in South Australia last year and talking to a producer and asking him about how is he thinking about sustainability at his operations with feedlots, and he said, carbon consultants coming and talking to him every second week, trying to convince him to do things, and he was likening them to snake oil salesmen, which I think is not, plenty of very credible carbon consultants, and many here this week, and Elders also offers carbon consulting business. But I can see his point that how do you know what's real and what's not? There's lots of different models on offer. It can be, they've got more pressing things to think about on an everyday basis, particularly in the current climate with, uncertain weather conditions and commodity prices.
Yep. Lewis, I'm going to invite you to be an agent provocateur here. We've just heard from 3 people with Australian links that we've got amazing ag tech down here. We have amazing farmers. We're at the forefront of change. We're leading the world. Sounds like it's under control.
Sounds like it.
You share that view?
I don't deny it. I've never been to a country that says our farmers are terrible. I've never been, which is true for most of the case. And it's especially because food and farming are things that are so wedded to the identities of places and to the politics of places and to the economy of places. But the political economy of the sector itself is quite it's one that you need to unpack a little bit more carefully. Let's take the idea of investments, for example. First of all, to not avoid answering the question, are they doing well? Yes. Are they highly regarded globally? Yes. So I don't want to avoid answering the question. Is it enough? No. All right. So I'm going to get back to a bit of expanding on this, right? Think of a lot of what we think about in terms of technological advancement and how it serves, what purpose it serves. So we had a very wonderful example of tractors of the future. A tractor is supposed to be a tool for the farmer to improve productivity. But right now, the farmer is a tool of the tractor company to make money. Once you understand the nature of that relationship, then you ask the question, how do we design our investments in a way that delivers on meaningful impact? If our investments are primarily targeted towards making money, we develop a very perverse system in which the same farmers that you described that are doing so well are end losers to a global technological competition where they have very little power. We've seen this in other areas. We're seeing it happen across different sectors, right? So I think if I were in Australia, part of the question I would ask is, how do I protect these farmers? How do I protect the custodian relationship that they have with the land here? How do I protect this advancement in a way that it serves the ultimate purpose of meeting citizens' needs and their well-being? My primary question would not necessarily be, how do I make money off of this situation?
Is there a problem with John Deere making money if they see that money is to be made in more sustainable solutions? There's an argument that's where the money trail.
Oh, I think they should make money. I think they should make money. Absolutely. There's an argument that innovation needs a bit of input. So this is not the question here at all. And there's lots of organizations and financial institutions that are quite aware of this. We've heard quite a few examples. It still doesn't change the global dynamic in terms of financial flows and relations between financial institutions and people that are responsible for provisioning. And I would be careful to not blanket this as everyone in the field playing a role. What we're hearing here is not the norm, it's a minority. And you would agree that this is the case. And in fact, this minority has to compete in a space that is so antagonistic that sometimes you have to think twice whether even the amount of money you're putting in will survive in this highly contested space, because someone who has no scruples will just come in and invest in a much less careful way and make the profits. So it's not just an issue of providing finance, it's an issue of changing the architecture through which resources and finance is provided to these farmers.
Okay, great. And that's a great link back, Katherine. I wanted to throw to you now, because you have worked, you're on the board of the Credit Suisse Responsible Consumer Fund. Tell us a bit about your experience about the amount of money out there for responsible investing and whether you feel it can have an impact on this quest.
Sure, and just to put the money into context, we are seeing in 1 year about $2.6 trillion financing sectors which destroy biodiversity. So I just wanted to acknowledge, Lewis, your point, which is there's a lot of bad money, money seeking profit going into sectors which destroy biodiversity. That is, I think, something we should separate from this room here, which says if there are solutions, they should make money and they should be attracting investment and they should be competitive on the global scale, because Australia's got more to help the world transition and to help solve some of those challenges. But it is a massive amount of money. 2.6 trillion is double the GDP of Indonesia. It's about the GDP of Canada. So it's a lot of money going into bad stuff. Fortunately, there is money going into good stuff as well. And we're seeing, you all know the numbers, but it's a $26 billion ag tech market that's grown 7x over the past 5 years. You know, these are big numbers, and I believe we need to make the business case, and we need to say that these sustainable, regenerative, and carbon or nature positive solutions are investable. We need them to be investable, because otherwise this ends up all being charity, and there is not enough philanthropy and government money to save the world, basically, and actually that's not economically sustainable. There needs to be a value-generating component, and that's why the Responsible Consumer Fund was set up to deliver on SDG 12, so responsible consumption, what you eat, what you wear, and responsible production, so how you produce those things. The interesting thing is that that fund invests in listed companies, and you'll all know the depressing story of Danone, which introduced a bunch of sustainability measures and ended up seeing their share price tank and their CEO get judged out. And part of that investment thesis of the Responsible Consumer Fund was to say that you need to take a longer-term view, that investors and that companies need to take a longer-term view when they're evaluating the transition plans and the sustainability opportunities and resilience of companies. As we all know, big companies report quarterly. Introducing a sustainable measure doesn't change anything within a quarter. And so we have major market failures and systemic flaws in the financial system, in the way that we report and measure and track companies and what they're doing to meet some of these climate challenges. But the Responsible Consumer Fund was set up to aggregate a bunch of listed companies, public equities, and not only make a stronger case that we need this longer term time horizon when analysing companies and their sustainability measures, but also to engage with those companies more effectively. Often we're seeing sort of AGM territory, shareholder challenges to companies and what they're doing, but we have an urgent crisis. We've also got a bunch of existing companies, existing business models, which don't change overnight. You don't turn the lights off overnight, you don't change practices overnight, and frankly, unless there's more engagement with companies around the transition, which is part of the function of the Responsible Consumer Fund, we're going to also see some perverse outcomes. And we do see perverse outcomes where it's more exciting for people to put money into green solutions and leave existing operations often in the hands of private equity, which doesn't have to report on a lot of that stuff. And so really being able to understand the transition journey is going to be fundamental because, Lewis, I agree with everything that you're saying in terms of market failures and the need to move faster and the fact that there's a lot of bad money going to a lot of bad stuff. Frankly, calling it out without then doing something differently in the way that we talk about transition finance is just going to be admiring the problem.
Yeah, okay. Now, I want to go from system-wide, Danone, publicly listed companies to really micro here, and I want to extend this conversation from 5 to 1,000. So it might get a bit noisy here, but we're going to try and filter it. So we've got some great questions coming in. A reminder that you can submit questions by Slido, and I'm getting lots of great ones here. And I might start this one with you. These concepts are very macro. How is a farmer running a small 5 to 10 million turnover ag business with extremely thin profit margins expected to deliver on these societal issues without losing money?
With difficulty often, I think. The carbon credit system and establishing carbon projects is supposed to solve some of that they can establish the projects and earn the credits and generate the ACCUs back. But that is problematic in itself. That's a big upfront cost. There's uncertainty around whether you're going to need to hold on to the credits for insetting purposes and market access in the future. And you shouldn't be in a rush to sell off the offsets to others. So it's not an easy question. I think, but it is evolving, and I think the solutions will get cheaper over time. I think we're looking at things like biologicals and biostimulants and how much of a substitution we'll see in our farm input or rural products business over time from chemicals. And I think these things will come down the cost curve and they will get cheaper and they will just become a replacement ultimately.
Natasha, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, look, it's a great question. And I'd just like to start by really clarifying that the expectations or the direction that supply chain might be heading in are not universal. So not every farm is expected to get to net zero. Not every farm will have the capacity or the capability to do as much as the farm next door. We will see those that have significant capability and complexity do a lot of the heavy lifting because they can. We will see some farms actually have very limited capacity and capability because they're in a weather zone where literally I'm more worried about the fact that it hasn't rained since September, where commodity prices are extremely variable, and actually I just need to make sure that my farm is economically viable. So I want to reassure everybody that the expectations here are not universal. When we talk about the transition to lower carbon, actually in agriculture, mathematically, it's almost impossible for agriculture to get to net zero. However, there is enormous opportunity for agriculture to take advantage of the transition. And by that, I mean that we've got the opportunity for every farm to think about what might be the farm practices that are going to actually achieve a positive economic outcome. So I might be able to lift yield, I might be able to take cost out of my business, and an improved environmental outcome. So I might be able to lower emissions or I might be able to avoid emissions. And so for the farmers who are listening to this conversation, it's also not about going from zero to hero in a season. So our encouragement is really to think about building awareness of what is actually happening in the ag ecosystem. So what are supply chain conversations? What are the supply chain conversations being had? What is your supply chain expecting? And how is your supply chain helping you? How is your bank helping you? Building awareness, building education, and thinking about what your options are. Then moving through to an understanding of what practice change or what interventions might be appropriate. In some farms, it might be as simple as thinking about, well, could I replace that diesel water pump with a solar water pump? If I do that, actually I've taken costs out of the business and I've improved my sustainability credentials. So I've achieved an economic outcome and I've achieved a sustainability outcome. For other farms, it might be, I'm thinking about going to short duration, high intensity grazing or changing my grazing management practices. But I'm worried that because I've been farming like this for so many years, I know when I farm like that, I get that outcome. And when I get that outcome, I can pay the bank, I can feed my family, and I can pay the bills. So I can't make massive shifts in a season. So what could you do? Well, could you split a couple of paddocks and try it in a couple of paddocks, a split paddock arrangement for the next season and see what happens? How can we think about encouraging farmers to baseline? If I was leaving anybody with a next step post today, baselining I think is incredibly important. Your data is also incredibly important, and that might be a separate conversation, Tim, but thinking about building awareness, education, what are some of the practices that can be implemented? How can I use those practices to get both a positive economic outcome and a positive sustainable outcome? And then also, how might I think about emissions measurement or baseline measurement?
Okay. Thank you. Lewis, did you want to
I wanted to say this is such a good point that is often forgotten or really badly communicated, that not everyone can go down to zero. And in fact, it's going to be really impossible for quite many of these small operations to go down to zero. Hence, two things. One is we need to make a decision collectively as a society. If we have a limited carbon budget or water budget or land budget, which sectors do we prioritize and protect? Farming is clearly one of those, food, essentially. It's an essential sector. How do we protect this, or do we allow farming and food the same budget as transportation? You start seeing this, and this is something a small farmer cannot do on their own. It's something that needs to be decided at a much broader policy level, at investment level, and at other levels. That's one. Two is to recognize, I hope those are Australians clapping. If you recognize then that not every farmer is the same. There's small farmers that they don't need to be in lecture halls to go produce well on their farms. How do we ensure that these small farmers are not put into spaces which is not their mainstay, which is actually distracting from them? Part of what you're seeing in Europe right now with this farmers' protest is design of legislation that is not well tuned to circumstances on the ground. So it is not that these farmers are denying that there's climate change. It is not that these farmers are denying that they need to solve these broader problems. They're being squeezed by large corporations. They're being pushed by policies which they don't understand. And they're getting complaints about affordability of their foods. And supermarkets are rejecting produce which they bring because it doesn't meet the criteria. They're squeezed from every direction. What do you want them to do? They're not going to stop existing just because, well, it's not just because. So actually understanding this dynamic and protecting this space is so critical. It then asks the question, which is a very difficult question thankfully it's not my question to answer. How do we put in place criteria? How do we put in place policies that separate this very vulnerable group from this very advantage-taking group, one? Two, how do we also ensure that farming doesn't end up just as another product that is in a highly competitive market space where competition is a zero-sum game, but a collaborative, more enhancing game? And three, how do we choose where we put our money in a way that it actually exercises these values? In a very strange way, which I find the ethos, the global financial architecture and the cutthroat ethos of it actually does need a bit of the very calm Australian approach right now to slow things down, because at this level of capitalism, we will not make it. So maybe part of what you should export is this very gentle approach on how you design and engage with people.
Interesting. I want to take that theme of not everyone moving at the same pace and not everyone needing to move at the same pace and recognizing not everyone should move at the same pace and take that back up now to corporate level. And we have someone, for example, raising why aren't we calling out the big issue with the Australian industry that the red meat industry won't meet its carbon neutral targets in 2030. I wanted to start, if I could, with Katherine on target setting. it seems in a way, the further you get from the farmer, the more willing people are to set ambitious carbon neutral targets for Scope 3, even if all their emissions in Scope 3 come from primary production. So we see the retailers, Woolworths and Coles, comfortable setting Scope 3, the Nestle's and General Mills behind them, the McDonald's, they all have Scope 3. But as we get closer to food companies and companies that supply directly into farmers, much more reluctance to do that, much more appreciation for the difficulty of measuring Scope 3, much more consideration, will we actually have the technology to meet these pledges? And do we blow up credibility by making pledges we can't meet, and that will ultimately be unhelpful? So do you think pledges are important on Scope 3? And should everyone be making them? Or is there a certain sense to this logic that we can't be sure, we shouldn't be misleading people?
The short answer is it's really easy to set targets, and it's very hard to not just deliver them, but to know how to deliver them and know how to communicate the pathway to deliver them. What we often see is that companies are setting targets, and then they don't have the buy-in at the company level to even develop a transition plan or a transition pathway. Right. I think what we're also seeing is how easy it is to set targets and then push down the requirements through the value chain or through the supply chain. And I think that's really what you're talking about here. This, the closer you get to the producer, the sort of more real that decarbonisation agenda becomes. The reality is, though, and I again, don't mean to be controversial with you, Lewis, at all, but we're not going to change the face of capitalism. I think we do, or maybe we will, but not in the next couple of years. And so if we're not honest with each other about the dynamics that are currently facing producers and then the retailers where those targets are being set, then we won't come up with near enough term solutions. So to answer your question, targets are actually part of some of these big retailers' public commitments. That's how they are meeting shareholder demands and pressures, and not setting targets for them I don't think is the right thing. They can't get out of, I guess, a target setting spiral. What they need to be doing is working further down the value chain to meet those targets rather than passing it on. I know there's a Coles Woolies kind of frustration in this room, and in the UK that's a Tesco Sainsbury's kind of similar conversation sometimes. But it's egregiously unfair to not have conversations down your value chain, and egregiously unfair, I think, also not to be part of developing the technology solutions that you described to meet some of those targets. I know other people on the panel will have something to say about this, but I just wanted to reinforce the reality is people are setting targets. They're setting they're signing up to SBTI, the Science Based Targets Initiative. They are making net zero commitments. They're being penalised if they're pulling out of these things. So I don't think it's going away. So it's kind of a moot point to be talking about setting targets.
Do you need it to attract capital? Will you need to have a target, no matter how difficult that looks, in the next few years to attract capital?
It depends at what industry you're in, obviously. If you are trying to attract green finance and you don't have a transition plan, or you want to attract some of the lower cost lending, maybe you get a relief on your interest rate payments because you're hitting certain sustainability targets. To be credible and to attract that type of money, you need to have targets and a plan to get there, and a plan is always really helpful. The gap I think that we're seeing here is actually in the cost to set those targets, to understand those milestones, to develop those plans, the human capability on top of everything else to be doing that, the shared learnings, the shared resources, which is obviously what Elders does a lot of. So attracting that type of green capital, absolutely, you need to be able to show how you're decarbonising if you're in a high carbon industry. If it's ag tech, it's a very different conversation. But I'm just saying we're in a market where those targets, the horse has bolted.
Yep.
So let's talk about how to get there.
Anna, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I think, and it's not just attracting green capital. I know as elders sitting in investor meetings, we get asked all the time about our targets and how we're going to meet them. And it's not just about setting the targets, but there's a lot of interrogation about what are you doing and what more could you be doing. And that's from the big super funds in particular. So it's not just green capital, it's all big investors now, I think.
Yep.
And money's pulling out. Sorry to double bite at the cherry, but we're seeing pension funds particularly pulling capital out in circumstances where they don't believe companies are on target to meet those milestones. And so the penalty, similarly, we're going to see products being excluded from markets like Europe because of CBAM or California, which was mentioned earlier. So just the horse has bolted, so we actually need to figure out then how to get there and how to make the funds and capital available to do it.
I mean, Elders gets this question about, we have a feedlot, Kalara, and some investors say we would be more investable if we divested that feedlot. It doesn't take away the methane emissions, they still exist, but it makes us as a stock more investable. So it's an interesting kind of dilemma that we have, and we don't think it's the right thing to do that. We think it's a great investment.
So the horse might be off and running on that one. The other one where the horse is bolted, Natasha, is on discounted funding that some in the audience think you are now offering. So the question is, where do we get our discounted funding from our business via green loans? So perhaps it's a somewhat cheeky question, but you did say that it is possible to fund people with cheaper money.
Absolutely.
Can you expand on that a bit, telling us how widely available is this? And also, how do you afford this? Are you backing this against cheaper funding you're getting in wholesale markets? How is it sustainable for you?
Yeah, look, I think, so to sort of set the scene around that, first of all, if we think about what is required to incentivise producers to invest in sustainable farming practices, we not just have to provide education and awareness, we actually need to provide economic relief so that they can redeploy that capital into new farming practices, because changing your current farming practices to a new farming practice today still costs money. So the way that we can incentivise that action is to provide discounted finance, and the way that we do that is through what I would describe as probably Australia's most comprehensive suite of green financing solutions. So for those farmers that are buying equipment that has a green component, green asset finance is available at a discounted rate to what you would normally pay for a standard piece of equipment. For those producers that might be looking at undertaking some CapEx on farm that's designed to introduce or enhance sustainability outcomes, then our Australian first agri-green loan is available. That is a substantial discount to market price, over 150 basis points. So this becomes very economic for a business that might be thinking in a high inflation, high interest rate environment, I don't know if I can afford to invest. We want to incentivise that investment. We also want to come up with, to your point, I think, Katherine, opportunities for larger producers, so either sub-investment grade, investment grade or corporate ag, to be able to link their sustainability credentials publicly to their finance. So Australia's first sustainability-linked loan for agriculture we provided to Stockyard, and their incentives are directly linked to them achieving their sustainability milestones. We've also got to invest in new and emerging ways to finance as the industry moves really rapidly. So what I've described there is actually fairly traditional finance, but just packaged up with a discounted pricing option. How we're now thinking about it is how we can use the emerging carbon economy and potentially in future the biodiversity markets to think about these as tangible assets and how can the bank actually support farmers leverage those assets. So here in WA, we did our first pre-finance of a carbon credit transaction, which enabled organisations to borrow against the future value of their Australian carbon credits and to not have to rely on freehold security, which is what banks have traditionally done. So you're certainly seeing us lean into not just using traditional forms of finance, but doing it in an incentivised way, but also creating new opportunities for new types of finance to recognise farmers who are investing, to create opportunities to redeploy capital, and to be innovative and support the Australian ag sector. This is really important because throughout the last couple of days, there has been some narrative around it's really important for farmers to do this because if farmers don't do this, someone else will do that. And so we want to really focus on the opportunities for farmers to participate and engage in the transition economy and to optimise the outcomes for themselves so that we've got overall an economically sustainable ag sector. So very much on the incentivised action front.
Okay.
It's actually not very helpful to the conversation to talk about to talk about the stick rather than the carrot.
Okay. Anna, a question here that I might put to you about soil carbon. Given that soil carbon projects can unlock trillions for farmers, why are Australian farmers so reluctant to set up projects?
I think there's a few reasons for that. One is the upfront cost. The cost of soil testing is quite prohibitive at the moment, and particularly for smaller farmers, for small farms, it's just, they don't have that upfront capital to invest in it.
Closing time almost.
I think there's also uncertainty around policy change in the future. They're aware that it would lock their land up for 25 years, that might have implications for when they go to sell. There's a lot of different types of contracts out there with carbon farming sort of consultants or providers, and it's complex. So I think there's, first of all, we've recently done some customer research on this, and I think of 700 farmers across Australia, only 23% said that they were interested in establishing a carbon project in the next 3 years. Mm-hmm. And one of the major reasons for not was the high upfront cost and uncertainty around policy change, and then not really understanding, conflicting information around what the best model to go with is, I think. And I think it's, as I said this before, it's dangerous to give away all of your ACCUs. You might need them in the future, but you can't expect somebody to be sort of committing that upfront capital. I think it's been marketed really well to farmers as a revenue diversification opportunity,
yes.
Just like putting a wind turbine on your property. But the reality is it's not really like that. And I think there's an awareness of that, and so the response is perhaps to do nothing in the short term until there's more certainty.
Yep. Okay. We are rounding out here. We've got about 7 minutes left. I'd really like to hear from each of you one last call to action or a point that you'd like to leave the entire audience with, or a group, whether that's the investors, the tech startups, the primary producers, the government representatives here. Katherine, you have the least notice on that, but if we could start from you and work back in a minute or less, your final call to action.
Sure, there are two, because I think sometimes the conversation today might feel a bit schizophrenic. I'm here saying, Aussie ag tech is where it's at. You guys are killing it. Please, main message, come and talk to me after, because we have a $200 million VC climate tech fund. Amazing. That can solve lots of these global challenges and meet climate goals for the world, for Australia, to improve productivity here, but also solve some of those global challenges. So it's a great news story. Come talk to me. The other conversation is really feels like at the producer level, how the hell am I meant to pay for all of this stuff? You're imposing standards, targets, additional requirements when money's really expensive it's a highly competitive environment. What am I meant to do with that? And I guess that's where it's a harder ask and it's a longer slog, frankly. And I guess my call to action or my recommendations would be, don't think some of the green finance is snake oil. You used that term earlier. The reason banks and investors are looking to provide some of that lower cost lending, some of that early stage equity, some of the catalytic instruments that we're seeing, offtake guarantees for new products, for example, or lower carbon products. The reason is because A, they've set targets themselves, so it's how they deliver. B, they back that transition to make what you're doing more resilient to extreme weather, especially drought, more resilient to regulatory and transition risk, so you won't be locked out of markets. And frankly, that's a bet on the way that the market's going. So let those investors take that bet and help you guys. So I'm sorry it's a bit schizophrenic. I'm kind of cheerleading on one side and then feeling the frustration on the other side. And the recommendation or the call would be speak to capital providers because they're setting targets around climate as well, and they are there they should be there to help with that transition and help pay for it.
Yeah. Thank you. Natasha, minute or less strictly, please.
So I'd say Australian agriculture has got an amazing story to tell. There is a tech story, there's a producer story, there's a supply chain story, there's an industry story on every corner. My call to action is know your number, tell your story, and share it with everybody who you can. Australian agriculture is at the pointy end. Tackling climate change, managing nature, and solving for food security. Be proud of the industry that we all operate in and know that we all want the same thing, which is an economically vibrant and sustainable ag sector, which is also supporting improved environmental outcomes. There's a lot to be proud of.
Thank you. Anna.
I'm going to say be curious. I think there's a lot of really great solutions out there. There's a lot of trials of extension projects you can be part of. Talk to your local elders branch, find out what you can get involved in. Talk to your neighbours. There's a lot to participate in, and it's not all hard.
I think that's a really important point. And again, that's kudos to you for turning up at this event, because that's exactly what they're doing, and I can see how helpful it is. Lewis, please, close us out.
I think this already is a wonderful thing happening in that we need more collaboration than we need competition right now. We're in a highly contested space with a challenge that is much bigger than we've understood for a very long time. And the science on this is quite clear. It's not even contested. I think the question we're discussing is, how do we work amongst ourselves as different parts of society to arrive at a better end for everybody? This brings it down to one last thing. What we're actually discussing now are the values of what we want to have as a future society. As a policymaker, the decisions you make reflect your values. As an investor, the decisions you make reflect your values. As a consumer, the decisions you make reflect your values. If we do not put those values into action, all of this is just a technical exercise around something that is so fundamental and elemental to us.
Yeah. And I think that's a great note to end on. Here. We've reached the end of our time. Thank you so much for your engagement. We've had so many great questions coming through. We haven't had the time to go through them all. I hope we've addressed some that have been relevant and interesting to you, and it's certainly fueled a fantastic conversation out here. Please join me one more time in thanking our panel this afternoon. Thank you so much.